Hi AP Seminar students, Mr. Muller here, and in today's video we're going to be talking about how you can evaluate an argument. And to do that we're going to be using a particular acronym called RAVEN. I just do that. And this is a particular process that you can use to make sure that a source is credible. Because one thing you have to make sure is when you write argument or present argument, the evidence you use must be credible. And if there's a question of its credibility, you have to defend it. In our last video, we talked about how to break down a piece of evidence into claims, reasons, and evidence. Now we're going to see how we can evaluate it for credibility. This is also an incredibly important video lesson. Hope you're ready. I'm excited. Let's get started. Now, one thing that I have to just convince you of is that topics are not just pro or con. There are so many different perspectives on topics, controversial things that you either hear about or read about. It's not just here's two alternate perspectives. There are so many. And we have to be very careful in reading and listening to these opposing perspectives and arguments to make sure that they're credible. Because if they're not, honestly, we shouldn't listen to it. So what's the proper process in order to look at a source and evaluate it? We use a process called RAVEN. And it basically, RAVEN is an acronym for different parts of a source and how credible it can be. Now, one thing I want to note is that if a source does not meet every single part of RAVEN, that does not mean that it's not credible. Let's say the reputation of the author is a little off, but everything else is fine. Well, just because one component's off doesn't mean it's not credible. Even if it hits 2 or 3, it still might be credible as long as you can justify that choice. So let's talk about each section. RAVEN. R stands for reputation. You always have to think about the evidence that an author uses. Is the evidence, whoever made that, reputable? So for instance, let's say I'm writing a journal article and I cite, and I'm talking about how Google Glass is an amazing invention. And part of my evidence, I cite the creator of Google Glass. Well, I'm not really using the best reputable authors because the author that I'm using is the person who created Google Glass, and so he's not going to have bias. Or maybe I'm citing the author of blogs in my arguments. Well, the reputation isn't good because they don't have a PhD. You also have to look at the author of the article itself. If they're trying to write an argumentative piece, do they have a good reputation? What else has the author written that suggests you should believe them? Are they considered an expert on the subject? So you not only have to think about the reputation of the author of the source, but also the author of the evidence that they cite. Second part of RAVEN is the ability to observe. Was the author of the source there to collect that data? A lot of times what an author will try to do is make an argument saying, oh, this is bad and look at all the horrible things that's happening. Well, were you there to see those things? A lot of time columnists will give an opinion about a maybe protests or some sort of social issue that's going on, but were they actually there? Vested interest is the V part of RAVEN. Vested interest is really interesting because why is that author writing that source? Are they doing it to make money? You always have to think about newspapers, right? Why are they taking that position on that issue? What is the readership like for that newspaper? Is that author just trying to say things they know their readers will appreciate? Are they doing this for money or notoriety? Are they part of a research study or part of a university and they're doing it just for their research? That's something you really have to look at. What's their vested interest? Another section of RAVEN that's really important is the idea of expertise. What background or education does the author have? Not just the author of the source, but the authors of the evidence that they cite. For instance, again, if I'm using a blog as my evidence, well, that guy isn't an expert. So I have to make sure that I'm using people who have PhDs, who are experts in the field. I have to make sure my author, if I'm really going to believe him, has done enough or has written enough about that particular topic to say he's an expert. Doesn't mean they have to have a PhD, but they should write extensively about that topic. Last thing is neutrality. Can I detect bias in that source? Can I see they're just taking one particular view and just hammering it home, and they're not looking at counterclaims, and they're just really taking one strong position? If you see that, that's going to be an issue. So that's Raven. Another thing that you need to take a look at when you're evaluating argument is something called logical fallacies. These are particular things or characteristics that authors use in arguments in order to convince an audience that are not valid. Now, I'm not going to go through every single one. What I'd like you to do is actually go to that URL on the slide and just briefly look at examples of what these different logical fallacies are. Just take a minute, go to that URL, check those out. Just go. Okay, you're back? Okay. These are also part of how you evaluate an argument. Now, how can you test the evidence in a source? So let's say, for instance, AP Test Part 1B, where they ask you to break down the evidence in a source and tell me which source is credible out of two particular sources. Or if I give you some practice, or maybe we do a summative assessment, I say, here's a particular source, is it credible? Break it down. How do you do it? The first thing you do is go through Raven. Read it. Maybe on the side of that paper, put down the aspects of Raven, then go, okay, reputation. Can I find out anything about the reputation of the author of the source, the author of the evidences they cite? What about their ability to observe? Were they the one who did this study, or were they citing other people? What about vested interests? Do I know anything about why they might have done this? Look at the particular, what source is it from? Is it from an academic journal, or is it from a magazine? Is it from a blog? Who's the readership for that source? Are they doing it to make money or notoriety, or are they doing it actually to research it? Expertise. What's the expertise of that author? What's the expertise of the authors of the evidence that they cite? Can they be credible? Is there neutrality? Or are they just completely biased and pushing one aspect? You note all those things. Another thing, look at the dates. If you're looking, and this is the dates of the evidence they cite in the source. If they're citing old evidence, that's a big red flag. Because especially when we're looking at the academic field, things that are over 15, 20 years old, unless it's a foundational source, something that's incredibly important to that field, you know, we've come a long, long way in studies and researches. Why are you citing something so old? Also, think about where the source comes from. Is it from a newspaper, magazine, a blog, an academic journal? Where it comes from is really important. If you're going to use evidence in an argument, or an author uses evidence in an argument from a blog or a newspaper or a pop magazine, you have to really question that. Why aren't you using academic journals? Another thing you should do is make sure that you note logical fallacies. So note, as I'm reading this, okay, what logical fallacies do I see? Because when you actually have to respond, is this source credible, you have to note reputation, ability to observe, vested interest, expertise, neutrality, logical fallacies. Based on the evaluation of all that, I can say this is or is not credible. Now, does that mean you're going to be able to hit all those different parts of Raven? No, but you're going to try and hit as many as humanly possible. So let's practice this. First thing, I'd like you to open up this link on this slide. It's a Forbes article called Global Warming Scientists Scrap Real Science, Bow Before President Obama Instead by Patrick Michaels. I'd just like you to read it. Just stop the video, read the article, come back. Okay, have you read it? I mean, he makes a very compelling argument. You can tell he's very passionate, Mr. Michaels, about this particular issue. So let's go through Raven. If we go through Raven, let's look at his reputation. Does the author of this article have a good reputation? Just type his name into Google. Just type it into Google right now. Just see what you get back. Go ahead, do it right now. Did you check? Yeah, reputation isn't good. Was he there to observe all of these things that he's talking about? No. What vested interest does this guy have? Again, look at Google him. Look at some of his background. Does he have a particular vested interest to making this type of argument? Go ahead, check. Did you check? Yeah, he's tied to the oil and energy industry. I think he has a particular vested interest to saying that particular argument because he's being paid by those industries. Let's look at the expertise. Is this guy an expert in this particular field? Does he have a PhD in it? Check it out. No. Is he neutral? Can you detect that this has a lot of bias? Oh, absolutely. And what about the particular logical fallacies that you see? For instance, I noted, and I'm actually going to go out of the slide real quick, some of the ones that I saw were name-calling, polarization, and straw man. And so he has those logical fallacies in that argument as well. So now I have to determine, is this a credible argument? And I could say, no. The reputation and expertise of the author is lacking. It's completely biased, and it's using these logical fallacies. Based on that information, as well as the vested interests of him trying to make an argument for particular corporations that support him, this is not a credible argument. But when you read it at first, you thought, oh man, this looks pretty good. He's very passionate. But when you dig a little deeper, you have to have that critical mindset. And unless you're looking specifically at the author, unless you're looking carefully at the evidence that he uses, you might say something's credible when it's really not. And this is important because when you cite evidence in arguments that you're going to make, you have to make sure it passes the credibility test. Hope you learned something you did not know before. Thanks for watching.